Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. Glad to be with you. Hope everything's going well with your podcast. You're learning a lot, you're meeting great people, and you're having fun. Are you having fun? If you're not having fun with your podcast, we need to chat, because podcasting is meant to be fun for everybody, right? Well, sometimes it's a lot of work, but for the most part, it is fun to be able to get on the mic, talk to the world. It's amazing what we can do with the podcast, and I'm hoping that your podcast dreams are coming true. If they're not, howtopodcast.ca. Let's get together. Let's chat. Let's see what we can do to help you to do better with your show and grow your show. All those good stuff. Glad you're here. Thank you for pressing play. I had somebody reach out to me recently in a consultation call between the two of us, helping them with their podcast, and the topic of securing a sponsor for their podcast and going out and finding that sponsorship level, where they pay you to be a podcaster, and what does it take? And is there a downside at all? And there's a lot of upsides, obviously. To make money with your podcast is a huge thing. Great if you can do this. There's a few cautions, though, that you need to consider when you're thinking about whether or not working with a sponsor is something that's going to work for you. Just going to put these out there for you to consider. They're not meant by any means to distract you or discourage you from ever looking for a sponsor for your show, because there are podcasts that start right out of the gate, first episode, bang, they've got a sponsor. So it's not common, it's the most, 99% of podcasters get a sponsor on episode 1, but there is a potential you can get a sponsor. So don't let somebody tell you have to get a trillion downloads before you can reach out to a sponsor. You can get a sponsor right away if that's what you want to do. But keep in mind, the moment you go into a formal agreement with somebody, there's a few things you need to consider. And we've said it many times on the show, and we'll say it many times in the future. I am not an accountant. I'm not a lawyer. So please don't ask me those questions, because I can't answer those. I didn't go to school for this. I can't answer those legal questions or those accounting questions, because, again, you live in a different place than I live, and you have laws that I don't have, and I have laws that you don't have, so it's very hard. But in general terms, I wanted to bring this up so you have an understanding, or at least spark some thoughts in your mind going, wait a minute, is it really worth the time and effort to get a sponsor for my show? And after we kind of go through today's episode, I hope this kind of gives you some things to think about for your podcast. Okay? So it's all about the money here on the podcast, and I'm excited to have you here. All right, let's jump in. So right off the bat, one thing I'd like to just bring up for you to consider before we jump into more of the content today around sponsorship and what it's like to work with a sponsor. Some of these sponsors that you're going to be potentially talking to, a piece of their marketing budget is what they're going to use to spend to advertise on your show. Now, we're talking about a company with a marketing budget. Companies track their expenses and may reach out to you as part of this agreement, asking you for a receipt for the money they're giving you to advertise on your show, so they can put it through their records on their end for their accountant, because they're a company. Now, if you're a independent podcaster and you're getting your first sponsor and you're all excited and super happy, the moment they send you that email and say, can you please send us back the receipt for this payment that we've made to advertise on your show, that's a moment in time when you haven't really maybe thought about the fact that, oh, I'm not really a business. I'm just a guy, or I'm just a podcaster in my basement going, I'm not set up to issue receipts. What happens? Do I charge tax? Is this a taxable thing? Again, you need an accountant. And that's a new level that you maybe haven't anticipated for your podcast. The moment they ask for a receipt, you're dealing with a business, and they need to show all of their income and expenses, and you are now an expense for them. an income for you and an expense for them, and they're going to want to track their expenses. So you might be issuing receipts for the very first time, and you might not be set up for that. So my suggestion for you, and throughout this entire episode, is that you need to find an amazing accountant and sit down with that accountant and talk to them about what your plans are and find out what you don't know before you go out and secure your very first sponsorship. Just keep in mind that possibly they will ask for a receipt, and the moment they do, they're going to put it through their taxes on their end, you are their expense, and that is going to tie back to you with your address, your name, your information, and you will become part of the tax world with that receipt you give to that company for advertising on your show. Also, if somebody's giving you donations, they're giving you a hot tub so that you'll talk about their hot tub on the show. And there was no money transaction here, but you got a hot tub that you didn't pay for. And the deal is, if you talk about our hot tub, we'll give you a hot tub, which is worth, fill in the blank. I don't know how much a hot tub is. Should you claim that? Again, I would say you need an accountant for that. That's a question for your accountant. Keep that in mind as we kind of go through today, that the moment you work with a company, you are now their expense, and they like to track their expenses, so they're going to track you. And in that moment, you are now not just a podcaster, but you are a company, just like everyone else. And the best companies work with accountants. So please keep that in mind before you get too excited about securing your first sponsor. Just a word of caution. So let's talk about some of the things. Again, remember, I'm not coming at this episode trying to dissuade you and steer you away from sponsorship. Sponsorship can be great, but I want you to keep these things in mind as you set it up, so you set it up properly. Okay, that's the reason for this episode. So here we go. Some things to consider about setting up a sponsorship deal and becoming paid by a sponsor. Some things you need to keep in mind. First of all, the control of your content and the authenticity of your show. Here we go. The moment money starts trading hands, money coming from a sponsor to you, and you accepting payment from a sponsor, sponsors may, some, not all, some sponsors may exert influence over your content, which can impact your creative freedom and your authenticity to talk about whatever you want, whenever you want. Now you have someone looking over your shoulder going, maybe we won't talk about that, because we're paying for this episode. Maybe that's not a good topic, or we don't really agree with your view on that specific thing, or we don't feel comfortable having our name attached to that episode and that topic or that guest or that opinion. A sponsor has the right, in a sense, because they're paying you to do this podcast episode, to maybe add some direction to your content. Sponsors might request specific topics or themes, potentially steering your content away from your original vision, or asking you to not talk about certain topics. As well, they want to align their brand with you, and you may feel pressure to promote products or services that you don't genuinely align with, or your personal brand or values don't really match together. So they may have a suite of products and you use one of the many things they do, but they want you to talk about everything they do. And you have never experienced the full line of their products. So can you really speak with genuine conviction that this product from this sponsor is something that you really promote and you use and you have knowledge of? Because if you don't, and you get on the mic and try to convince your audience that this is the best product in the world by the best company in the world because they're paying you. How's that going to translate for your audience, especially if your audience has built a relationship with you and they know, like, and trust you? When the moment you become fake, you may lose some of that amazing audience that has followed you to date. So setting up an arrangement with a sponsor might lead you down the path of losing a little bit of control over what you say, when you say it, how you say it, who you say it to, how often you say it. They might want to control some of your content. The next part is contractual obligations in your podcast. So you're going to be writing up a contract with this sponsor, and you are bound by the contract. You are bound by their requests of you because they're paying you to do this. You are now working, in a sense, working for that sponsor. Really. So sponsorship agreements often come with some very strict requirements. Again, remember, they're a business. They've done this before. They've paid for radio spots. They've paid for their image to be plastered on a bus, or they've bought commercial time on television. So they have this already mapped out for the most part. So you're just part of their marketing fund. So they're going to have some expectations of you because they've worked with other people before. So they're going to want maybe some control over where their ads are placed in your content. Sponsors may dictate where and how their ads are integrated into your content, which could disrupt your preferred format. They may want all of their ads smack in the middle of your podcast. And if you've only had podcast commercials at the very beginning, before the podcast starts, or at the very end after everything's done, they may not be happy with that. They might want it smack in the middle, or maybe multiple spread out across the podcast. They might have a say over ad placement, and you need to know that up front as well. They might have in their contractual obligations with you a frequency to how many times you talk about their products. And also beyond the podcast, maybe they want you to talk about their products and services on your social media and in your newsletter and on your website. And there's a lot of other pieces to hear as well, beyond just, hey, I just got $20 to get an ad in my podcast. There are some other things attached to this as well. And this is one thing I don't think a lot of podcasters think about. When you're an independent podcaster and you are just podcasting on your own and you pay your own way and you don't have a sponsor, you can create as many episodes or as few episodes as you want. You can be consistent or you can be scattered and podcast whenever you feel like it, whenever the mood hits you. When you sign up with a sponsor, you are now being paid by them, and they now can direct you as to how often you podcast, the frequency that you podcast. And there's an expectation that whether you feel like it or not, you have to produce an episode this week because they're paying you and they're expecting a return on their investment. Sponsors may require you to adhere to specific timelines. This in itself can be stressful for a new podcaster working with a new sponsor. You've never done this before. It might impact your workflow. So this whole thing about seasons, no seasons, weekly, twice a week, daily, once a month, I'll do it when I feel like it. Oh, the dog's sick today, I'm not going to podcast. You might have to podcast. It might become your job. In that moment, when the thing you loved to do because it was fun and you could do it whenever you want now becomes a job, in that moment, are you prepared to be a podcaster as a job and not just a hobby? So a lot of people trying to get you to take your podcast hobby and turn it into an income. But if you fall in love with podcasting because it is a hobby and because you have freedom, a sponsor might take away some of that freedom and you're going to now have a job. And I wondered if you're really prepared to podcast as a job. On top of all of this, The next part of all this, beyond the contractual obligations you have to the sponsor, there's also the administrative burden of maintaining all of the reporting and everything you have to do behind the scenes to give back to the sponsor the detailed information they need to know if the sponsorship is working out or not. So there's an administrative burden you're going to have to take on or hire someone to help you with simply by having a sponsor. Now remember, I said earlier, many sponsors have worked with other media types before: radio, TV, billboard, print ads, flyers in your mailbox. So they have worked with other people before, and they expect a certain level of reporting. Like how is the podcast doing? How many listeners for episode 30 did you get? Where are the listeners? How long are they listening to the episode? Are they listening to the ad? Are they getting to the ad? Do we need to move the ad to another spot in the podcast so the ad's being played? They're going to want to know about your demographics of your audience. There's an administrative burden to all this. They're going to be looking for reporting and analytics. And you may need to now provide detailed performance metrics for each episode. And all these reports need to be provided back to your sponsors on top of you being a podcaster. On top of your job, on top of your family, on top of your things, you are now reporting back through email and spreadsheets and graphs and documents and attachments. There's a reporting side that you now inherit as a podcaster that now you have to then communicate back. That's your responsibility. As well, there's a lot of paperwork, potentially, contracts, invoices, other documentation. This could be time-consuming to manage. And just the communication piece, email, phone, regular emails are going to be going out. There might be meetings you're going to have to attend. There's been people I've heard of that have had to do in-person events. There's been, come to our company meeting. We need you there to present to the board of governors about the podcast. Now you're going to attend to these meetings, and you're like, I'm not a person who likes to stand up in front of people and lead a meeting. Right? There's a lot of that going on. There's an administrative burden when you work with a sponsor. There's expectations. If you don't meet their expectations, as great as your podcast is, they're not going to be interested because they have to report back to their company on if the podcast is serving and bringing new clients. So it's got to be a win for them. If it's not, they're not going to call you back. The other part of all this, there's some financial considerations to consider that maybe you haven't thought of yet. So before you reach out to this new sponsor, think about this for a second. Working with a sponsor, there's going to be payment terms. Some sponsors may have long payment deadlines, and this might affect your cash flow. So there might be a 30, 60, 90-day thing. So you've done the episode, sent it out. You're not going to get paid the day the episode goes live. It might be 60, 90 days later that you see your first payment come through. So if you're expecting like instant money, like I'm going to go to work today at my job that I'm not really loving, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to be a podcaster and make money. Maybe 90 days from now, you might make some money, but you won't make it today. Just keep that in mind. They have payment terms, and you're going to have to adjust your everything, your finances, your mortgage, your car payment, your food, your laundry, your kids' fee, all that stuff. Everything's got to be adjusted because now you're waiting on the payment terms that are in place from your sponsor. There might also be conditional payments. Compensation might be tied to hitting certain milestones or metrics. So if your podcast episode doesn't get 1,000 listens in 7 days, we're not paying you. Wow. So you've done all that work and you still might not get paid. There might be some compensation milestones to be aware of. So keep that in mind. Please make sure you check that out in your contract. As well, there might be some limitations to the income in total. There might be some exclusivity clauses that prevent you from working with other brands. So you work with brand A, and then you're not allowed to work with brand B. You're not even allowed to talk about them. They might be your favorite. Brand B might be your favorite brand ever. But brand A, you have a contract with, which then makes you not able to work with brand B. Now what? What if brand B has a great offer for you, but you have a contract with brand A for 6 months? You're going to have to tell brand B, which you love, that you can't talk to them until from 6 months from now. So there might be some limitations placed on you because of the contract. This could potentially limit your income abilities and the opportunities ahead of you because you're bound by a contract. Keep it in mind. Again, I'm not trying to tell you should not work with a sponsor. I just think you need to be aware of these things. And these are some of the things we talked about in my client call. So I wanted just to share them with you as well. There might be also some legal and reputational risks when you work with a sponsor. When you work with a sponsor, you can expose you as a creator to various risks. For example, reputation. If a sponsor's reputation changes, it could have a negative impact on your brand. So you're working with a company, the owner of the company does something terrible, gets destroyed on social media, and the whole company is in turmoil. And here you are promoting that company on every episode, and your audience goes, hey, Dave, that company is like, they did something horrible, and here all you do is talk about them? Well, I've got 6-month contract. I got to talk about them for the next 6 months, even though the world is falling apart. I'm still promoting them. How does that make your audience feel? How do you feel about that? The reputation of the company you work with might fall apart. And here you are, still propping them up. Through all of the bad things, you still got to show up on the mic and be Mr. or Mrs. Sunshine, talking about how much you love this company, even though you're like, oh my gosh. There's another part of all this, the legal and reputational risks around your working with a sponsor could be who owns the content. Some agreements may actually grant sponsors extensive rights to use your content, potentially limiting your control. I've heard of podcasters who work with a sponsor, and then the sponsor takes the podcaster's stuff and shares it on their own as if they did it. And you're now just the voice of the company outside of the podcast. Or they come to you and say, can you do these commercials for radio for us? Nothing to do with the podcast. They just want you to voice their commercials. Now you're a voiceover artist. So are you prepared for that? That's something totally different. And are you being paid for that? Maybe, maybe not. They might own your content. Wow. So that's interesting. That's a long ways from a hobbyist, independent podcaster who can do whatever they want, whenever they want, right? There also might be some compliance issues. You may need to adhere to specific disclosure requirements or regulations related to the content that's being sponsored. You might not be able to speak freely, share your opinion, use bad language, talk about other products or services in the world, avoid anything to do with politics or religion or orientation. You might not be able to talk about and share your opinions on any given topic because they own the keys to your show because of that contract. So that leads right into the next one, and that's a little bit more around the creative constraints that might come into play by working with a sponsor. So let's just do this as a comparison. Think about an independent podcaster is like that person at the beach. You know, they ride those little Sea-Doos, those little motorized, looks like a sled, right, on the water. One person, two people, they go zipping around. They can go anywhere. They're having a great time. They can go anywhere they want. Those things are so fast, right? They're tiny, and they just go. Easy to maneuver. They can They can do all kinds of great stuff on those. Compared to a big, huge cruise ship, that thing takes a long time to get up to speed, takes up a lot of space, doesn't really turn sharp corners quickly or do any fancy tricks. It's meant for a long journey. Totally different, both on the water, but totally different. When you're that independent podcaster, you're on that Sea-Doo. You can go anywhere, do anything you want. There's really no restrictions. When you're in a big, huge cruise liner thing, you have to dock at certain places. You can only go where the water's so deep, and you have a lot more rules. So there's a little bit of control and flexibility that you lose the moment you move over to being sponsored. The sponsorship can have a real impact on your creative process and how you do your podcast. You might not be able to be as spontaneous, like on a Sea-Doo, go anywhere you want. Take that little river or take that little bay or go wherever you want. You can go into shallow places, right? You might not have the spontaneity to do whatever you want, whenever you want. They might want a pre-planned sponsored content, which may reduce the ability to be spontaneous, responsive to current events. Nope, we want you to have it all pre-planned, everything mapped out. Everything has to be recorded and go through our checks and balances. You need approval on everything that you do before it goes live. Well, you just limited yourself a little bit to being top of mind and following trends and being in the news, commenting on what's happening in the world. There's also a balancing act that happens here. You're going to need to find a way to seamlessly integrate sponsored messages without compromising your content and your quality of your show. There's also another side of this that we don't talk about a lot. It's more around the audience listening to the show and their reaction to this new sponsor you're so excited about in your podcast. What do you think the audience is going to think of you getting a sponsor for your show? I can tell you as a listener of podcasts myself, where I work a night job, so I have free Wi-Fi and I listen to podcasts at night. So I get about 40 hours a week of podcast listening in. It's a lot, but it helps me get through my job. So thank you to all the podcasters I listen to. You keep me company. But when I hear a podcast, or I find a podcast and they're sponsored, you hear the commercials at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then they also ask for me to donate, buy them a coffee or join their Patreon or send them money. I'm like, well, you already got paid by your sponsor, so I'm not as apt to support you financially because you already got 10 commercials in your podcast and you're already making money apparently. So I'd much rather give my donations to a podcaster who's not sponsored and doesn't have multiple ads in their show. So what do you, as a listener of podcasts, my question to you, do you feel compelled to give money to a podcast when you know they're already collecting money by having paid ads in their show? Your relationship with your audience may be affected by you having a paid sponsor for your content. There might be, for example, some trust issues, especially if your audience has known you in the early days of your podcast when you didn't have sponsors, and then you do have sponsors. There's a change that happens there. There might be an overemphasis on sponsored content, which might lead to a loss of audience trust or perceived authenticity. They feel like you're just doing this because you're getting paid to do this. And if that's what's coming across through the microphone and into their ears, you may actually start losing the audience that your sponsor's so passionate about getting to, because your audience is going to start leaving. And now you're not as attractive to the sponsor because your audience is getting smaller because of the ads. So keep that in mind. As well, it might kind of dilute your content a little bit. Again, remember, before a sponsor, you could do whatever you want, whenever you want. Great. But when you have to then serve the content and focus and include the sponsor in your content, frequent sponsorship mentions could actually overshadow the primary content in your show and potentially alienate some of your viewers and listeners. So just keep that in mind, right? When you have to talk about something because you're being paid to talk about it, That means you don't have time to talk about the other things that you would love to talk about, but you're not being paid to talk about. So your audience is going to pick up on that. And remember, your audience, the sponsors are not really as interested in your show as they are to speak to your actual audience. That's who they're really interested in. So don't be offended by that. They're happy to use your podcast to reach these people, but they're really more interested in the people listening than you and your show. Something to think about. The next part as well, as we kind of wrap up here on things to consider when working with a sponsor, is all around time management. When you're managing sponsorships, it can actually be quite time consuming. We've talked about all the things mentioned here already, and all this will be in the notes that goes along with the podcast, so you can see right there on your phone as a reference point as well. And if you have any questions about this stuff, anytime, reach out to me. Like I said, I had this conversation with a client, and I just thought I wanted to bring this to you as well, because I felt it could give you some value for you as you consider sponsorship for your podcast, whether it's a good thing or not for you. At least you have this as a guide. But this whole thing around time management, there's other elements to this beyond recording your podcast and posting it to your hosting site and having it go to the world and doing other artwork and all that other stuff. There's a time management piece to working with a sponsor, in that you're going to be working through the negotiation process, not just once, but many times, renegotiating. All of that's going to be happening in the background. You're going to have to go out and find and secure appropriate sponsors, which is going to take you time and effort to go find these sponsors if they're not looking for you. Also, there's going to be a fulfillment of obligations, ensuring that all sponsorship requirements are met. And this is going to be an ongoing task for you as well. There's going to be things for you to monitor, maintain, report, keep track of, watch. You're going to have to do it. It becomes more of a job. Really, it really does become more of a job. And you need to be aware of that up front. By understanding all of these potential challenges, again, it's not meant to keep you from working with a sponsor, but just to educate you. Creators can make a more informed decision about whether pursuing sponsorship aligns with your goals and your values for your show. It's crucial to carefully consider the terms of any sponsorship agreement that you sign. Again, lawyers and accountants exist for a reason, everybody. And you need to assess whether the benefits outweigh the potential drawbacks for your specific podcast and your situation. Keep in mind that if finding a sponsor, having to change your content or change your show to benefit the sponsor, if that has a negative impact on your listener and your listenership starts to go down, you lose listeners because of the new sponsor or because of the new direction for your show, you're actually going to be less beneficial to any sponsor as your audience shrinks. So you need to do something upfront to maintain this from the beginning. So what is a good solution? Dave, I want to have sponsors in the future. I'm not ready right now. I'm just new, but I do want to have sponsors down the road. What do I do? Well, I think the first thing you need to do is build your audience, and to build deep connections with your audience now, and start building that response mechanism. One of the things that your sponsors will love from you and your audience is if your audience actually is engaged with you. Like you actually have feedback. You actually have emails or speak pipe messages or buy me a coffees, or you hear from your audience. You know them by name. They trust you. They come to your show because of who you are and how you serve them. And I would suggest putting in some sort of, not really an ad, but something that breaks up the content early in your podcasting journey to get them used to the idea that this could be a spot where you do have an ad in the future. Now, it could be something simple as breaking into your content. You could do something at the beginning before the podcast episode starts. That's called a pre-roll. You could also have something at the end of the show when you're all done. That's a post-roll at the end, right? And then there's the mid-roll. Mid-roll is like the holy grail of commercial spots because it's in the middle of the content and most people are listening. And I would say even more to the beginning between, like if you think of your gas gauge, kind of the quarter tank, there's empty, quarter tank, half tank, 3/4 of a tank, and full. I think the quarter tank to half tank is where most of the best commercial spots would be for a listener because people have put their phone away, they're into the content, and they'll put up with the occasional ad. The one thing I would tell you to do is maybe do things in that space where you break the content up possibly and maybe talk about something else. So if you're a solo episode and you're focused on business growth, maybe do a little spot where you break it up and go to a side thing, like you come on and say, hey, thanks for listening to the show. I just want to share with you in this little break here about a book that I've been reading, and I'll put a link in the show notes, but it's a book that complements what we're talking about today. And if you're interested, the book is called, and it's in the show notes. Let's get back to our conversation. And you go back. Doing things like that kind of trains your audience to go, well, that felt like a commercial kind of, but it had value as well. Those kind of things are great. I would encourage you to do stuff like that. And I would encourage you to build an audience that responds. If you build an audience that responds to your requests for voice messages or emails or signs up for newsletters or follows you on social media or those pathways to action we talk about, pathways to engagement, instead of calls to action, pathways to engagement. When you can get your audience to be actively participating in your show by following up and doing the thing you ask them to do, when it does come time for you to get a sponsor, hopefully the sponsor has something to do with your content and would be a benefit to your audience. That way you know that your audience would be interested in that sponsor and would support them. You will see a better return because your audience is engaged and they're used to responding to you. It's very hard to do a podcast one way for years, and then all of a sudden there's a big switch happens, and now you have a sponsor, and now your podcast is different, and now it doesn't sound like it used to sound. And your audience might go, hang on, why did this happen? Why is it so different? Oh, Dave sold out, right? Dave got a sponsor, and now we got to listen to Dave's sponsor, right? But if you can build this up over time, if that's your goal, you don't have to make money with your podcast. But if your goal is to make money, then you need to start planting those seeds now. And if you have any questions about how to do this, you're not really sure how to do this, love to help you. howtopodcast.ca. On my website, there's a calendar link there. There's also a special calendar link in the episode. You'll see it in your notes when you look on your phone. And that's a link for my listeners that listen to the How to Podcast series. So if you want to jump into my calendar and have one-on-one time with me, it doesn't cost you anything. But I promise, we'll get together, talk about whatever you want to talk about. And just like I did with the client talking about sponsorship, we can talk about anything you want to in regards to your podcast. Whether you've started or you're dreaming of starting, I'd love to help you at howtopodcast.ca. Or check the show notes. It's right there for you. Everything you need is right there. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for a sponsor, I wish you well. I wish you great success because I want you to continue podcasting. But these are just some things for you to consider as you think about, is a sponsor right for me in my show? Hopefully these ideas and these things will help you consider your next steps. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. You are amazing. Keep podcasting. Keep being you. There's a shortage of people just like you in this world, and we need you more and more every day. Thanks for listening to the show. Thank you so much for listening to the entirety of the episode, including this part. You know what? A lot of people leave right now. So we'll let them leave. Give them a second to go. Okay, now it's just you and me. We have our meetups that we do for the How to Podcast series. We do them during the week, and we also do them on Saturdays. So twice a week, you have the opportunity to meet other podcasters, just like you. Some people have just started. Some people haven't even released an episode yet. Some have been doing it forever. And we get together and talk podcasting. We want to help you in community to continue with your show, to start your show, to grow your show. So come and meet listeners of this show in one space on meetup.com. Again, through howtopodcast.ca, you'll see the links. It's completely free to join. Come whenever you have an opportunity to come. There's no commitment. You don't have to sign any waivers. You can just come join us. Come join the conversation. We'd love to have you there, because the only thing that's going to make these meetups better is you being there. So I'm hoping you will say yes. And you'll say, Dave, I'm tired of podcasting by myself. I wish there were people I could connect with that are fellow podcasters and share my frustrations with guests who ghost me, and my editing software is crapping out on me, and I'm just having this hard time. I'm just having a hard time coming up with podcasts, episodes, and titles, and all the things, and social media. Wouldn't it be great to get in a room with other podcasters and share best practices and learn? 3 of our 4 Saturdays every month are themed. So you have a topic, but that last Saturday of every month is open question and answer. Ask anything. Come meet a podcaster. Come enjoy the podcasting community through howtopodcast.ca. Come to our meetups. Can't wait to see you there.